So next up today, we have a couple of design-focused sessions, design and production. And specifically next up are the folks from Fortis, who will have the next couple of sessions, starting with Shawn Foust. Please join the stage.
Hi. Hello. Hi, everyone. This is great. Hi, I'm Shawn. I'm the COO of Fortis. I feel like we need a much better commercial than what we had. We just had that little clip that loops, which I was excited about. I've never even seen that before. I was like, oh, that looks great. And then there's the bank that was significantly more impressive. People walking through fields, like welding things. Anyways, hi. Yeah. So I'm Shawn. I'm here in Romania for the second time, which is very exciting. I like to do like the before and after picture before the pandemic and after, and just kind of talk about how it's impacted all of our lives and impacts the companies that we're building and everything. For us coming out to Romania, it's been interesting, right? I think if you'd asked me 5 years ago, hey, would you build a global remote first game developer focused on game design, I would have said no. I think it would have been very hard to get me there, to make me believe that it was possible. And then I spent 3 years in the pandemic working remotely, and it worked pretty well. It felt pretty good in certain areas and didn't feel good in other areas. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. But for our purposes, I want to talk a little bit about lanes in the game industry. So I'm based out in San Francisco in a small town called Half Moon Bay. And I've spent the last 10 years in Silicon Valley. And those 10 years have been pretty interesting. When I first started, it sort of felt a little bit different. I originally began in Los Angeles working in the entertainment industry for the movie studios. And that was not a good fit. I was not meant to work in Hollywood. It was not my thing, right? And so I moved up to Silicon Valley so I could work in video games. And that was right when mobile and social games were beginning to develop. And everything was very exciting because video games went from this very strange industry that was kind of dominated by 3 or 4 companies to all of a sudden being on Facebook and then all of a sudden being on the phone. And then there was this giant sort of expansion in interest for about 3 years from a bunch of venture capitalists that said, hey, we should put money into mobile games. This is a good idea. And they invested in a few companies out in Silicon Valley, and some of them were successful. And what happened was these lanes got established. And lanes are sort of how you talk about what you do. It's the pattern that you fit into so that people can give you money. And in Silicon Valley, there's sort of investable lanes and there's non-investable lanes. For venture capitalists, there's a set of sort of things that have to do with big shifts. They like shifts in the market, right? Before it was this way, right? Before it was free to play, and now it's all NFTs. The future is all NFTs. Web 2 is dead. Web 3 is the future. It's dead. Or yeah, we have the current internet, but that internet's going to die in the next 2 years. It's the new internet, and that's going to be the metaverse, and we're all going to be in metaverses, and none of this is ever going to happen again. We're going to never meet in person. We're all going to have headsets, and that's going to be our future. And then there's other things, which is the proven team. Oh, I was at Riot Games, and I was successful at Riot Games, and now I've left Riot Games because Riot Games is no longer the place where I can be successful. I'm going to do a new thing, and bunch of VCs come along and say, oh, that makes a lot of sense. The last one's picks and shovels. That's very much I don't make games. I make things for people that make games, and that's the real opportunity. And those are the things that tend to attract investment in Silicon Valley, just generally. And there's a lot of reasons why that happens, and there's a lot of reasons why the scale lanes, these are your AAA publishers, why they do the things they do. So they're always what I call arbitrage lanes, where they say, listen, because we're so big, we can do things better than people that are not big. Good example is, I have created, I've seen a battle royale that looks really good. People seem to like this battle royale. Well, we have a brand like Call of Duty, or we have a brand like Battlefield or whatever. Well, we're going to apply our brand and our publishing knowledge to that thing that people seem to like, because people will like that if we put it in Call of Duty even more, right? Those are arbitrage lanes. Also very successful. What you'll kind of notice here is that none of these talk about the creative portion of our industry, right? None of them talk about design. None of them talk about how like the creative process of making games itself might evolve. It talks a lot more about the processes around that creative process. And so there are scary lanes. Scary lanes are things where if you don't work directly inside of games, if you don't spend a lot of time making products, talking to people about them are confusing. A good example is let's take battle royales, something that we're all kind of familiar with, right? There was a period of time where people were very convinced that shooters were solved. There was Call of Duty and there was Battlefield, and they were going to fight every single year around Christmas. And then occasionally Halo would come out whenever a new Xbox got released. And that's how it would work. And that's how shooters were going to work. And that was the future of shooters. And nothing was ever going to change. And if you came in and you said, listen, shooters are going to be disrupted. It's not going to be about 5 people fighting 5 people if you're Call of Duty in a team deathmatch, or 16 people fighting 16 people if you're Battlefield. It's going to be about 150 people all parachuting down into a poison gas zone, picking up a bunch of loot, hiding in corners for 20 minutes before they die, right? And only one person is going to win, and 149 people are going to lose. And then, I don't know, maybe some point we'll have concerts in there too, right? That would never be funded. It's not fundable as an idea, right? No one wants to give money to that thing. It sounds insane. And it sounds insane if you don't really look at what's happening underneath the surface in the game industry. Why is it 150 people? Because it can be 150 people. Bandwidth makes it possible now, right? Like the degree of server deployment across the world for low latency environments makes that possible. The compute power of a phone allows you to have a large map sitting in the palm of your hand. The space that can be designed in has changed massively in the last 10 years. But not the companies and not that deploy capital into those spaces. They haven't changed massively because they have entrenched brands that they don't want to be disrupted. They have ways of doing businesses that they don't want disrupted. And venture capitalists are by and large people that come from like financial and investment backgrounds, which makes sense. Like, you need someone that can go to like the teacher's pension fund and get $100 million and then put it into an NFT, right? Like those people are like those intermediaries generally don't come from our industry. And so when you try to explain design concepts to them, you kind of get this like glossed over look, and then like confusion of like, why would you do that? Like, why don't you just make a metaverse? Everyone agrees that metaverses are the future. And I already told all these teachers in the pension fund that we're going to go into the metaverse, not into this new weird design thing you want to do. So that's why the lanes get scary, right? And it's really tough to talk about design lane as a competitive advantage. I talked about all this. So what happens to design? This is where the interesting thing really happens to me in the industry. So I'm a massive player of independent games, like indie games, like mod games. Like that's, I don't know, if you look at my Steam list, it's 95% games from independent development. And the reason why is because design is not really fundable through standard investment lanes. It's tend to go to parts of the industry that are not funded. It tends to reside in places where you really want to make a game. You don't have any choice. You're not going to get funding. No one's going to give you funding for your weird game. So you find some way to make it work at your home. It's you and maybe 2 of your friends that start working on some weird idea. And what you see is like these massive shifts in design, these massive games that eventually come out keep on appearing early on in weird spaces, right? So, the common example I use are modders. Like Battle Royale started out as a mod in Arma 2 or 3. I think it was Arma 3. And like, I never played Arma, but I bought Arma just to play that mod. And the first early experience was horrible. I cannot tell you how bad that experience was. Like trying to get in there, load in there. The servers were not designed for it. And then it kind of kind of moved over into kind of AA, right? So that was H1Z1, right? And then it started to get, all of a sudden the streamers were playing it and they all seemed to like it. And then it kind of expanded out there from PUBG and so on, so forth. Defense of the Ancients, we all know that. That eventually became League of Legends and Dota 2 on Steam. You see it from independent developers a lot too. So Among Us, a game that was released by a very small studio and kind of sat there inside of Steam for a year and a half with no one paying attention to it. And then we all got locked in during the pandemic, and a couple of streamers started playing it in Brazil. And then from Brazil, it went to the Middle East, and then it bounced back over into the United States and then expanded out massively from there. Agar.io spawned this huge kind of like cottage industry down.o, also developed in Brazil. Path of Exile. This was a bunch of guys that were very frustrated by their experiences around Diablo. They wanted to know, like, why couldn't you just make these heavily customized, very cool characters? And, they did it in a basement and, out in New Zealand. I don't know. Maybe it wasn't a basement. Maybe they had a house. I don't know. Like, they had a place where they made a thing. It was like 3 of them and it was cool. Right. So the design innovators like keep on coming out of not just small development efforts, but they also come out of places that generally don't attract investment from capital allocators, right? Like, VCs are not deploying a lot of money in New Zealand or Brazil or Ireland. And this sort of inefficiency around everything was the idea that got Fortis started. This was the core of our pitch. So Steve, the president of Fortis, and I were at Warner Brothers after they bought my last company. And I'd been at Warner Brothers for, 3 years, which coincided with the length of my contract. And, I left and had a conversation with Steve. And the conversation was like, what was wrong with the industry? Based off of what Steve had seen as the head of worldwide studios at a bunch of different places. He was at Zynga, he was at EA, he was at Warner Brothers, he had consulted at a number of different places, and I had been coming from the startup background. And sort of the core of it was like, why can't you pitch a company that says design is a competitive advantage? And what we learned through 3 months of pitching was everything that I just put in the first 5 slides, right? I cannot tell you how often when we kind of rolled out our pitch, right, this is Fortis. It's, and everyone's all excited because I've raised a couple of rounds and I've sold a few companies and Steve's got a really good reputation. So the VCs are all excited that we're showing up and we're going to pitch them. And we're like, listen, we want to acquire a bunch of studios in Romania and Brazil and Portugal, and we want to focus on game design. And they were just very disappointed in us, very upset, right? And they're like, well, is there like an NFT angle, right? And I was like, no, there's no NFT. And they're like, could you put it on like a slide? Like, just don't even have to ever make one. Just say NFT at some point. And I was like, I use the letters N and F and T at some point in this presentation, but never, like, no, we're not doing that. It's not what we're doing. And it's not because it's a terrible idea or anything like that. It's just not what we're doing. It's not the design, it's not the design lane that we wanted to occupy. And so what we kind of realized was, if you were going to build it, it was going to be really different. Like, you were going to leverage different talent than you were used to leveraging. You were going to use really different policies internally to govern how you made decisions. And most of the things that we had learned in other situations and other contexts and other companies was not particularly helpful to running a design lane company. And, what that boils down to is all my little differently phrases here, right? Like, we search for talent differently, because it turns out that just going onto LinkedIn and searching for game designer is not particularly helpful for finding the style of game designer that wants to build innovative products, right? It works differently. Well, first, we're remote, which opens up the world of talent to us. But, if anyone's been in a very tense argument around design, that the hardest part about intense arguments around design is that no one really knows whether or not they're right. Like, it's not like it's very clear that A is better than B. And so it often starts to be like this very like deep philosophical debate followed by a lot of emotions and feelings. Well, if you move that online, it gets that much harder, right, to have those sorts of conversations in a way that works. It organizes itself differently. This is really like you have to build up a degree of collaboration because of how unclear everything is, because of how hard it is to piece together, what the right path forward is, and then it greenlights projects differently. I could talk about that for like 5 hours. I cannot tell you how much the greenlight process drives me insane in the industry, and we'll get to it in a minute. Maybe we'll see. Let's talk about search for talent real quick. So the first thing that I've noticed about our industry is it's really performative, right? Like I do okay at this thing here, right? Standing up at people and then just pretending I'm charismatic and know what the hell I'm talking about, and like the industry really rewards that, right? Like if I go into a pitch and I start to say this is the future of games, people are like, oh yeah, maybe it is the future of games, right? If I go into an interview, it's the same thing, right? Like, oh, he has ideas, he thinks about them. What we've learned throughout time is that is not very well correlated with actually being good at making games. The strength of your moment to moment making shit up is not strongly correlated with your ability to sit there and think deeply about something and come up with a viewpoint on how the industry or a design might evolve. And so the end result is, for us, if you start to move towards the design lane where it's less around the performance, because the performance matters a lot when all ideas kind of feel the same and you're sort of not really pitching anything new. It's really like how you package it that matters. In a design lane company, there's a bunch of different ideas. And the question is how deeply can you think about and present them? And so for us, we've moved away from the interview as like this key standard for determining whether or not someone's successful. What we found is interviews are not particularly productive. We found that prior history is not a very strong indicator. Many people have worked at the company that will give them a job, and they've worked on the product that they were allowed to work on, not necessarily a really great indicator of whether or not they are independently strong. So for us, we've seen a lot of I've met 500 lead game designers of League of Legends at this point. Like I'm fairly certain there wasn't 500 on them, but they're all leads. They all made the game. They were all there. They were all wildly successful. And all of them have got funding because they were all there during that time period, which creates this incredible, powerful reinforcing mechanism for being inside of large companies that are successful, and creates an incredibly negative incentive for trying anything new, right? Intuitive thinking is a big one, like your ability to just kind of like quickly rattle off a bunch of different things. Like that's very highly prized in most contexts. If you guys have been in a green light meeting with a publisher before, you kind of know that any moment where you're not completely confident in your idea and know every answer to any question that they might ask makes them nervous, right? I think having some vulnerability in a conversation around your idea is actually a really healthy thing. It's just not it's not rewarded currently. Working. So for us, when we think about design lane, we tend to focus on asynchronous collaboration. We do a lot of writing and a lot of comments. There's a couple reasons for that. One, writing allows a person to put exactly what they think on the page, and then it allows people to comment it and prepare for a conversation, as opposed to just hopping onto a call and yelling at each other for a half an hour, and then whoever is the most powerful person in the room wins, right? Like, so we focus a lot more on the written side of the equation. We use Miro into the grounds, like, this giant spreadsheets interconnected. We have instead of a metaverse, we have a Miroverse of nested Miros that connect to documents. It's very exciting. Intra-organizational learning. We have a bunch of teams all working on complicated things. Right now, Fortis has about half a dozen teams. We'll probably add another, call it 2 to 4 teams over the next year and a half. And as we add those teams, we're trying to learn in one place and then spread those learnings to the other place. This relates to the kind of green light process, but we're progress bound. So a lot of times when you look at how games tend to proceed, they tend to be like a strict time limit. Like, what can you get done in a month? Which creates this very arbitrary sort of guideline of everyone has to frantically work towards something very quickly, and then they throw a bunch of shit at the wall, and then ideally about 3 days before you do the presentation, you put together a really nice PowerPoint, right? And that's kind of how it proceeds. In our case, it's like a constant flowing conversation around the progress you're making around the ambiguous idea that you're trying to figure out, right? If you were trying to figure out battle royales and you said, what would it be like to have 100 people inside of the same space and to organize 100 people against some set of rules? Well, that's a quite open question, right? Should it be 3 teams of 33? Should it be 50 versus 50? Should it be every person for themselves? Should it be small teams of 33 teams of 3? Like, which ones are strong? Which ones are weak? Which ones add? Which ones subtract from the experience? Those sorts of trade-offs are highly unclear. And what we generally tend to focus on is the running conversation of, do we feel like we understand more today than we did yesterday? And if we don't feel like we did, do we have any ideas what we're going to try tomorrow that increases our belief or our confidence that this idea is worth doing? Organizationally, so we focus on something called discipline guilds. We're like trying to roll this out right now, and it is tough, but the basic idea is everyone inside of a discipline sits inside of a macro organization inside of our company. So you might be a local person on a team, but what we found is if you're a game designer by yourself on a team, your opportunities for relationships, camaraderie, to learn, to grow are pretty limited, right? Most people that work in like independent development, usually they have 4 or 5 other friends that are also in independent development, and they go get coffee and complain to each other, right? Like that's like a key component of like that camaraderie. In Fortis, it's similar, which is like, how do you build these organizations? And the other part that we care a lot about is there's this tremendous pressure as you get more senior in the industry to move from your craft, if you're a game designer, let's say, to management. Like your career progress is capped as an individual contributor, and you have to become a manager. And so we've been using the discipline guilds as a way to basically increase the cap, so that a very, very senior individual contributor could help run the guild, could help run the discipline, could be a person that gives feedback, provides insight across the organization without having to leave their craft. They can stay within it. Game director prioritization is a very big shift. Generally, prioritization inside the industry is done by a producer. The producer is focused on a very specific thing, spending a certain amount of money and delivering a product on a certain timeline, which makes complete sense if you exist inside of AAA and you're doing a franchise model. If you know you need Call of Duty to come out every year, then it's really, how do I plan for Call of Duty to come out this year? What is the thing that we have to do? And missing your timeline is incredibly costly. Like, your mom's not going to buy Call of Duty for you anymore because it didn't come out during Christmas. That's a huge loss. And it makes a lot of sense why the organization is organized that way. In the design lane, particularly for service-driven games, which is what we focus on in Fortis, it is much, much, much more about like, hey, how do you actually give your game the best chance to scale? And since scaling can occur at any time of the year, because you're usually deploying money against marketing at any time of the year, it becomes much more about like, how do you set up that future success, and much less about how do I hit a particular timeline. There's a big focus on kind of like what's called the independent studio model in AAA development. You guys are probably familiar with this, having, some of you guys might have worked at EA before, and others, they tend to run an independent studio model, which is, it's a studio that works on a game, and then there's people that sit in the middle that exercise capital control. They basically decide whether or not to give that thing more money. When it doesn't work out, then generally you shut down the studio because you really don't know what happened, because they were an independent studio, and if their game wasn't successful and they lost money, then it's not really clear how to fix it, right? In our model, we have a bunch of like deeply interconnected teams, right? So the idea is like, many ideas are not going to be successful. When an idea is not successful, the last thing we want is to not know anything about that team. We want to be able to move that team on to the next idea as quickly and as efficiently as possible and not lose the talent along the way. Green lights. Okay, I told you I'd get to this. We're going through a lot here, guys. I know. This used to be an hour long, and I have 5 minutes, so bear with me. Also, I'm sweating. But so green lights. I really hate green lights. I really hate them. So like, I don't know how it happened, but at some point it was decided that the best way to make a decision on a game was to gather 30 people inside of a room, 25 of which have never made a game, and to have a designer come up with a presenter and then like pitch it of why it should exist, right? And the decision is really made based off of, you know, once the designer, you know, once the game director leaves the room, everyone kind of looks at each other and then they just see, you know, hey, is anyone going to say this is a bad idea, right? And they'll say it's a bad idea if it seems weird to them. You know, if they haven't seen it before, then they're like, yeah, it's like, I don't know, what is this? What is it? Uber for battle royales? Like, what is it, right? Like, how do I explain this to other people, right? And if it's something that's very familiar to them, it's like, oh, it's an MMO, and those guys over there who are our competitors are also doing an MMO, and we have to have an MMO because if we don't have an MMO and their MMO is good, then we'll look dumb. So we should do an MMO too, right? That's generally how the decision gets made, which is not great for the industry. And so what happens is you have these like periodic high stakes meetings with a bunch of low context people that don't really understand game design, how to build it, how to run it, right? And they tend to respond to the fidelity of the presentation. Like, did the thing look amazing? Like, was I excited by what I seen? And so you see this huge amount of energy and effort go into, you know, really what's vaporware for one presentation to show a demo of a thing that theoretically it exists, but definitely is not going to exist. You know, and we kind of read about this in Kotaku all the time, right? Like, in our case, we use like a running conversation. It's just constantly going every single week. So, Aurelian, Sonia, like Dan sitting in here, like they have a conversation with Calvin, the chief product officer, and then, you know, every week, and then me like every other week, and it kind of depends on how much they can tolerate me in the room. But like it's a constant conversation of like, what are you doing? What are you learning? How do you think you're going to proceed from here? How are you going to learn from the next thing? And we look at a lot around like searching a space. And this is the hardest part, I think, in everything that we are doing. Most people want to make a game. They start out with a game in their head that they want to make, and they just want to make the game. And everything tells them that the best way for their game to survive is to keep making the game. In our case, we start out with a search space, which is a theoretical idea. Remember, I had talked about the 100 people and how they could be organized and why they want to do them that way versus the other way. In our case, it starts to be very much like, what are all the boundaries of the idea? How far can you push an idea in all the different directions? And does one feel good or bad relative to the others? And then more importantly, what did you learn by organizing things this way versus that way versus that way? So you end up making a bunch of stuff that you know for sure is not going to work out, but you are probably going to learn something with. The amount of conversations that we have about taking people off of the standard track, it takes us months. Like the onboarding process of designers is excruciating inside of Fortis around how we explain this stuff and how we build this, because you basically have to reprogram people's like style of thinking around these ideas. Deeply, deeply interesting, exciting, horribly frustrating. Confidence as a model, I think, is different than the standard milestone checkoff. Progress as a model, like I think for us, like confidence is really hard to come by. It comes from the, you know, sort of a lot of consensus from a lot of the senior designers inside of the organization. And then it also comes from, as time goes on, validation through playtesting, lots and lots of playtesting, internal playtesting. We'll bring, you know, influencers in, streamers in, play it too. Like we'll do all sorts of different ways of trying to build up validation. But ultimately, you don't know whether or not you have a good idea, for sure. And the goal isn't to be certain, right? The goal is to believe that the bet that you're making is worth the time and energy of the people that are involved in making it. Closing. Okay. Yeah, with 45 seconds left. Nice. So I love this meme. I got this meme from Calvin, which I think is generally how it feels. There's so much going on in for us in particular, trying to build this company. Like you kind of are constantly reinventing the wheel, not just because you're design lane, but because you're remote, because you're employing people from a ton of work cultures, right? Like, Silicon Valley work culture is quite a bit different than Brazilian work culture, which is quite a bit different than Romanian work culture. The unifying aspect is that everyone wants to make a great game. Everyone wants to be involved in making something that, the world plays. And I think we're making good progress, but it's certainly a work in progress. So hopefully I'll get a chance to come back here every year, and like, I don't know, like maybe the flames will get higher, or maybe some of them will get put out. We don't really know, but that's where things stand today. And I'm out of time. There you go. Cool. Thanks, everyone. Let me keep it there.
Yeah. Thanks, Shawn. Great presentation. Let's see if there are some questions. Okay. Take them one by one.
Okay, I have a question related to your closing part.
Well, the fire?
It came to me during the presentation, but it's related to that. Do you see Fortis as the final company you're working with?
I would love to be done after this. Like, I'd love to make a company that really builds this out. I mean, my ultimate goal is to build Fortis up to the place where it can really generate these teams and be really well run, and then ultimately to step out of my position and run one of the game teams, right? Like, that was what I wanted to do, and then Steve like confused me and tricked me into like becoming an executive again, which was definitely not what I was after, right? Like, so if I could retire, building a game at Fortis, then I think I will have accomplished my goal, and that's what I'm after personally. That's what drives me.
Okay, I have several. I have a cold, so I have several questions, of which I will just select one in everybody's interest. How fast your process is compared to, I don't know, the traditional way of making games?
It's
how efficient would you call it?
So I would say it's significantly less efficient at making a game, significantly more efficient at finding new design options. And if you look at the outcome that we are going for, like, the outcome isn't sort of the plus one that kind of runs through a lot of the industry, right? Because we don't have any particular advantage at plus one, right? We're not a giant publishing organization that can just throw Star Wars on it and just win. Like, we don't have that, right? Like, we have to build something that significantly changes. So we look for something that we call minimum viable differentiation, which is, what is something that's substantially differentiated from the rest of the market, that is immediately identifiable as different from the rest of the market, that would get someone to actually want to play our game and stop playing whatever they're currently playing, right? That's the thing we look at. I think our process for that is pretty efficient at finding that thing. But I will be honest and say there's not that many companies that use this model. Like Supercell, I think, uses another model. Their design is very different than ours. Like, they focus on a different area of design than us. But that's, they're kind of known for working on a bunch of games, canceling a bunch of games, right? I think that's where you end up with much more often, which is why we start out with 6 teams rather than 1 team. Because we can't put all of our eggs in one basket. It's not like a guaranteed thing, like, oh, we're going to do a battle royale with this brand. Like, we don't have that as an option.
On your green light slide, you said that you push the boundaries of ideas. For example, in a battle royale, you test, okay, maybe it's with 3 players, with 7, okay, and how do you actually do this? So even if you're deep thinking it or stuff like that, you need, from my experience, you actually need to test it. You need to make that in order to see if it works. And if you're making it badly, if you're executing poorly, maybe you draw the conclusion that idea is bad, but it's actually not. Or maybe it's a huge context. That idea could work, but it needs more things. So this whole process seems highly expensive and doesn't really guarantee that you're going to make a good product in the end. It's I do understand the approach that Supercell has, because it delimits better things. So how do you do this? Do you actually code everything? You create everything that you imagine?
Sure. So the way it starts is with a concept, right, for us. And so what happens is teams earn additional resources being added to their team. So the first thing is the concept. Concepts for us work differently than most other places. Most of the time, people are like, I kind of think something is cool in this space and I kind of want to screw around in it. For us, it's it's like getting a PhD thesis defense or something, right? Like it's a dissertation defense. Like you have to basically pull apart an entire audience and what has happened in that audience that has generated sort of like a fragmentation in that audience, or like a certain amount of calcification or staleness in the design. And you say, okay, listen, here's the audience. This is what motivates them. This is what's happened inside of their space. Here are all the major things that are kind of true about that space that we believe we could change, that could generate that differentiation that's valuable, right? Those are what we call opportunity spaces internally. And then you have to describe those at great deal. I invite you guys to talk to Dan about writing his concept document. He had a great time. He loved it. And then once you go from there, you say, okay, here are all the unknown questions. And you just get them out of the way. You say, here are the giant things that we do not know how to solve. Because if we know how to solve everything, then there's no advantage to being a design lane company, right? Like if everything's very clear, then someone else is already doing it, right? You have to look at some set of questions where you look at it, you say, if you could solve these would significantly change the nature of this particular space. And then you put down, here's what we think is worth testing in order to figure out whether or not those questions can be solved. And that's your search space. And then everything is about speed of iteration. So like Jefferson sitting down here, he's running all of our production. Their responsibility is trying to figure out how quickly we can iterate, right, with a game director. Can we get 3 play tests a week? Can we get 10 versions of the game in a given week? Like that's what we tend to focus on, is how fast you can learn. And I think the big difference is the validation of whether or not you're learning something is being done by a bunch of extremely senior designers. So in most companies, you have like one person that's like a very senior designer, and he's kind of trying to explain what's in their head when they go to their team and they try to do play testing. In our case, you have a senior designer that's created something that's having that play test basically evaluated by 6 or 7 other senior designers. And so generally we think the signal of, hey, I think we're learning something here, this is what we're learning, like we have higher confidence in than we would in another situation. I do not want to pretend though, we have not released a single game. It's entirely possible that we are wrong. I don't think so though. The number of people that we have that have been in the industry for a long time, that have produced top successful games in innovative places, including our CPO, are pretty high. And I think when a group of them sit around and they play something and they feel like there's something meaningful and valuable that was learned in there, I have high confidence in those people. And I tend to have higher confidence in their assessment of whether or not something has moved forward relative to a focus group of 10 people that were randomly pulled from outside of the company, particularly in the early stages when, as you've said, it's all broken. It's a bunch of gray boxes moving around on a screen. Like you kind of have to fill in all the UI, UX, right? Like, it's not simple. In terms of, is it expensive? It's really hard to say. Like Silicon Valley is expensive to me, right? Where you like come up with an idea and you never test the idea because you can't test the idea, because if you're wrong about the idea, you can't get your next round of funding. And we've all seen this again, right? Where it's like a company raises money and then they raise another 100 million, 200 million. And they're like, oh yeah, it turns out there was no product here, right? It was because they could never evaluate it along the way. Right? Because if you really did evaluate it and realized it was a bad idea, explaining to your venture capitalist that's, maybe this metaverse thing's not going to work out, that $10 billion we spent is maybe not a good idea, looks really bad, right? All your incentives are to pretend it's a good idea until you really can't pretend anymore. I think moving all of that forward into small teams that are very agile, working in places that don't cost the same as Silicon Valley, I think that is a much better way to learn and to develop. And that's why we used the strategy we did.
I think we had one more question over there.
Hi, Shawn. Great presentation. Thank you. And best of luck with the strategy. So I take it you're VC backed. How did you get funded eventually?
Yeah, this is a good story. So Steve and I, when we decided to go out, we basically combined our networks together. And Steve sort of comes from, I don't know, the top of the industry, right? Like he's friends with all the CEOs at all the other, big game companies. And I come from venture capital, right? So I'm friends with all the VCs. And so what we did is we basically created 3 different pitch decks, depending on who you're talking to. Like, here's what it would look like if a VC were to fund us. Here's what it would look like if a private equity or a family office would fund us. Here's what it looks like if a strategic firm were to fund us. And we built this big list, and we went out and we pitched. And it was really frustrating, right? Very frustrating. The VCs did exactly what I said. They loved us. They wanted to invest in us. They just wanted us to do one game idea, and ideally don't mess with those weird people in Romania and Brazil. Just keep it in Silicon Valley, right? Because that's the model, right? The private equity firms are like, yeah. No, your idea sounds great, but can we give you $250 million to like buy some other random company first? And we understand that random company has all sorts of problems, but fix it. And then you can make games or whatever you want to do, right? So that wasn't a really good fit either. The strategics generally got it. Like when we talk to places, that are AAA publishers, when we talk to CEOs, like they generally got it. But generally what they wanted was to fix some problem that they had. Like, our mobile strategy is hurting. Can you guys help solve this mobile strategy? And I guess if you guys want to make a few games on the side, fine, go do that, right? Ultimately, we narrowed it down to a small set of like sort of strategic, investors, and we had kind of negotiated an opportunity, and we're getting ready to fly out for that opportunity. And like the week before, Steve said, "Listen, I got a call from Las Vegas Sands, and they're potentially interested in moving into games." And I was like confused, and I wanted to know why they wanted to, why they wanted to make that investment, what their goals were. And eventually, we went out and we saw them, and it started this very long conversation around like how they had built their company. They had just sold their U.S. assets, the Venetian, things like that, in Las Vegas, and they were thinking about whether or not there were other opportunities to kind of build different types of businesses. And so it was in that conversation where we said, listen, we're contrarian. We're trying to do these types of things. These are the things. And they're like, well, we're also contrarian. Like we've built multiple big properties in places that people wouldn't have expected. It's been very successful for us. We build long-term. We have a lens on how to invest in teams and build them out. And ultimately, they were the right partner for us. And so we're a wholly owned subsidiary of them. And we've been doing it with them for the last year and a half. It's been a fantastic partnership, and it's given us the flexibility to run this strategy, at this speed. I think for the alternatives, like there were other alternatives, I think they would have been okay. I think they would have worked out all right. They would have been different. It would have been a different company, though, for sure.
Thanks everyone. Great presentation.